As the summer of 2025 faded into autumn, the prevailing theme within the EU trade compliance and foreign policy circles was unequivocal: escalation. Escalation in Russia's military aggression against Ukraine and its hybrid operations targeting the European Union and several of its member states. Escalations in the EU's response to Iran's persistent non-compliance with its non-proliferation obligations. An escalation in the development of autonomous European Union export controls to address technological advancements and responding to new security threats. You are listening to This Month in EU Sanctions, your go-to podcasts for the latest updates, insights, and in-depth analysis of the EU's evolving sanctions and trade compliance landscape. I am your host, Jan Dunin-Wasowicz. In each episode, this podcast examines some of the latest developments shaping EU sanctions law and policy, combining legal and institutional analysis with a practical perspective on implementation, compliance, and enforcement. Subscribe to the LinkedIn newsletter This Month in EU Sanctions to receive a selection of monthly updates, including the topics discussed on this podcast. On September 19, 2025, the European Commission presented its proposal for the 19th package of EU sanctions against Russia. This latest package could represent a significant intensification of EU sanctions targeting critical sectors of the Russian economy and its support networks in certain third countries. The proposal includes a prohibition of imports of Russian LNG into EU markets, with a full implementation required by January 2027, the designation of 118 additional vessels associated with Russia's shadow fleet, the imposition of a full transaction ban on two of Russia's largest state-owned energy companies, an expansion of individual listings or asset freeze measures targeting refineries, oil traders, petrochemical companies in third countries, including in China, among others, a transaction ban on additional Russian banks, new restrictions on cryptocurrency platforms, the listing of foreign banks connected to Russia's alternative payment systems, a ban on investments in Russian special economic zones, and the introduction of additional export restrictions on items and technologies critical to Russia's military operation, including artificial intelligence, geospatial data, and key resources for weapons production. These export restrictions would also include the designation of 45 companies, both within and outside Russia. Meanwhile, the G7 issued a statement on October 1st underscoring their commitment to a significant coordinated escalation of measures. Interestingly, on October 14th, the US Secretary of the Treasury emphasized the US's commitment to working with G7 partners to significantly escalate pressure on Russia, calling on European allies to ratchet up their pressure not only against Russia, but also against any country that finances the Russian war machine through purchases of Russian oil. The 19th package was being discussed in the Council of the European Union at the time of this episode. Concerning Iran, on September 29, 2025, the Council of the European Union formally reimposed all nuclear-related sanctions on Iran, following the invocation of the Snapback mechanism under the JCPOA by France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. The decision restores the full scope of restrictive measures that had been suspended since 2016 in response to Iran's persistent non-compliance with its nuclear commitments. It also includes several autonomous EU actions on top of these measures. The reinstated sanctions include, generally speaking, travel bans and asset freeze for designated individuals and entities, comprehensive economic and financial sanctions covering trade, finance, and transport, including a ban on the import, purchase, and transport of Iranian crude oil, natural gas, petrochemical, and petroleum products, as well as related services. Restriction on the sale or supply of key equipment for Iran's energy sector, gold, precious metals, diamonds, certain naval equipment and software, the reinstatement of an arms export ban and prohibitions on items, materials, goods, and technology that could ultimately contribute to Iran's enrichment-related reprocessing or ballistic missile programs and related activities. The sanctions include financial sector measures, including the freezing of assets of the Central Bank of Iran and major Iranian commercial banks. The sanctions also include transport restrictions such as preventing access to EU airports for Iranian cargo flights and prohibiting the maintenance and servicing of Iranian cargo aircraft or vessels carrying prohibited goods. The development is significant in several respects. First, of course, because it reintroduced sweeping EU sanctions on Iran, but also because, as a result of this decision, the new sanctions create a new circumvention risk from an EU perspective. With the reimposition of EU sanctions against Iran, EU operators now need to be mindful of the evasion and circumvention risks that may derive from these new sanctions. Concerning export controls, the European Union's commitment to autonomous and robust dual-use export controls was solidified on September 8, 2025, when the European Commission adopted a delegated regulation amending Annex 1 of the dual-use regulation. This update served two primary objectives. First, it brings the list in line with decisions taken in the multilateral export control regimes. It also seeks to ensure further effective EU-level controls of new technologies, thus contributing to security in the trade of dual-use items in line with the 2024 White Paper on Export Controls. The amended regulation introduces restrictions on a range of new dual-use items, including, for instance, quantum computing technologies and advanced semiconductor manufacturing and testing equipment, among other items. Importantly, this update reflects the EU's increasing willingness to act, leveraging Article 17 of the dual-use regulation to impose restrictions addressing technological advancements and responding to new security concerns. I am thrilled to welcome our next guest, Marcin Lukowski, a leading Warsaw-based sanctions compliance expert, researcher, and practitioner with over a decade of experience in trade compliance, export controls, international law, and anti-money laundering. Marcin has published extensively on sanctions enforcement and implementation, including his recent peer-reviewed article of Frontline States Tackle Sanctions Against Russia, Implementation and Enforcement Dynamics in Poland and the Baltics, which was published in the Journal of Economic Criminology in 2025. I enjoyed speaking with Marcin about the evolution of the sanctions framework in Poland and the implications both from a policy and private sector perspective. Marcin, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Hi, hello.
Marcin, for those listening to the podcast who don't know you yet, I was thinking perhaps could you tell us a little bit about your background and your professional experience, and more specifically, how you got to EU sanctions?
So I would say that I am standing on two legs. My first leg is working in the private sector, focusing on trade compliance and sanctions, and the second leg is being engaged in all of the academia-related activities. I am looking at the topic of sanctions and trade compliance both from the perspective of the practitioner as well as the person who looks at it more from the theory perspective. And yeah, I am working in sanctions for more than a decade now. I started to work in sanctions by accident, I think, as all of us. So it was just the first job which I got. It was the consulting company that was providing services specifically in trade compliance, which back then was not very popular topic, especially in Poland. But the environment is changing, and also here in Poland, the topic is on the rise right now.
Looking back 10 years ago when you started in this field, how did the trade compliance landscape look like in Poland?
It's hard to say how it looked like because it simply had not existed. So the thing is that, and I will definitely go deeper into this aspect once we are discussing, but we have to understand that from the policy perspective, it seems that trade compliance in the meaning of sanctions was never a priority for none of the Polish governments just until the war in Ukraine began. So, of course, there were robust regulations related to customs law, and there was the legal framework for the trade in dual-use items. But the thing is that there were no regulations related to sanctions, and as we know, once a country becomes a member of the European Union, as it was in case of Poland in 2004 and 10 other countries, all of the acquis communautaire needs to be recognized by the local law. And it's the same with sanctions, despite of the fact that they are automatically binding because they are adopted in the form of regulations. I believe that that's Article 8, for example, of Regulation 833, 2014, 8 or 15, I never remember, which basically says that the member state must adopt laws that would allow the enforcement of the EU sanctions. It means that the member state must adopt the penalties for the violation of sanctions, must indicate the authorities that are responsible for enforcement, etc. And the thing is that in case of Poland, it had never happened just until April 2022. So before that time, there were no regulation allowing implementation or enforcement of sanctions in Poland. And it is extremely bizarre situation, especially considering the fact that the first sanctions on Belarus were introduced 2 years after Poland joined the EU. So in 2006, sanctions against Russia were introduced in 2014, and we had to wait until 2022 to make violations of the EU sanctions enforceable in Poland. But that's not all. The regulation that was adopted by Poland in April, it covered only two EU sanctions regimes. So it was the regime directed against Russia and regime directed against Belarus. And small legal act, as we call it, does not recognize any other EU sanctions regime. So until today, there are no penalties for the violations of the sanctions introduced against Iran, for example, against Syria, and for any country. So this is kind of an absurd situation because we have the directly binding law derived from the EU level that prohibits something, but it is completely unenforceable in Poland. So basically the specific acts are prohibited, but you cannot punish anyone for violation.
Before we go a little bit deeper in the reform, when you mentioned that there was no enforcement framework in Poland until April 2022, was it also the case that there was no designated national competent authorities for sanctions until this point, or had there already been teams in place in the Polish administration to deal with the implementation and with guidance related to sanctions, or is this does the whole framework only start in 2022?
So I do not work in the public administration, but looking at this specifically from the perspective of the private sector, I am not aware of any such team. So even if it existed, they were so silent that nobody heard about them. Certain activities were taken by the AML administration, let's say. However, EU sanctions, other than sanctions against Al-Qaeda and terrorists, are not within the scope of the responsibilities of the AML bodies. So in fact, we can say that enforcement of sanctions was done mostly at the side of the customs administration when they spotted that certain goods at the border should not be crossing the border. But due to the fact that there were no penal provisions in the criminal code, the only thing they could do was to stop the shipment, but it was never possible to criminalize the behavior of the wrongdoers.
Got it. In April 2022, what prompted the reform? Did it come from the government? Did it come from the parliament? Who initiated the momentum to introduce a new framework?
So let me answer for this question in the way that these were the people who prompted this. It would be some kind of the over-interpretation from my side, but let me give you an example from the real life. So it's a fact that Russia's attack on Ukraine was extremely important for the Polish population. So I mean, we were really touched. Like there was a huge rush of the regular people to help the Ukrainian refugees. There are a few millions of Ukrainians who came to Poland, and it was like the social movement. People simply wanted to help. Even I was engaged in cleaning of one of the buildings that was to be adopted to the place where the refugees could live. And what I want to tell you about the attitude of Poles is that the Polish national dish are so-called Russian dumplings, pierogi ruskie. Russian dumplings, the word Russian maybe is not the best one because it should rather be the Ruthenian dumplings. But in general, let's call them Russian dumplings. So after the Russia's aggression, when you was entering the restaurant and the waiter was giving you the card, you could not find the Russian dumplings in the menu anymore. It was crossed out, replaced by the Ukrainian dumplings. And this small fact shows what approach Poles have towards Ukraine and towards Russia. Also, I have checked it before our discussion, and according to the Eurobarometer, there are 83% of Poles supports sanctions imposed on Russia, which is one of the highest levels in the EU. When we compare it with the other countries, in Germany it's around 75%, in Hungary it's around 50%, in Cyprus it's almost 40%. So Poland is still definitely in the hardliners camp. When you have this kind of social attitude, the government needs to address it. And it must be said that they have done a great job very quickly, because between the aggression and the time when the law became law, when the draft became law, these were only a couple of months. So the first 5 EU sanctions packages were addressed instantly. The problem started after adoption of the law. Once it was adopted in April 2022, the war was continuing, as well as EU continues introducing further sanctions packages. But the way how the Polish law under the Small Sanctions Act is constructed, it works in a way that the Polish regulation simply enlists the numbers of the articles and assigns the penalty. So, for example, it says that for the violation of Article 2A, you can be penalized with the imprisonment of minimum 3 years. So the thing is that every time when the EU was adding new articles, such as 5N and others that were not covered by the Polish regulation, the problem reoccurred. So there were still no legal grounds to penalize the activity. And this state lasted until February this year, February 2025, when the Polish sanctions law has been updated. The problem repeats again. It was adopted in February, so after the 15th sanctions package, but now we have the 16th, 17th, and 18th that are not automatically covered. Of course, there are a lot of nuances. It doesn't mean that those sanctions packages are unrecognized completely. It simply means that if new numbering was added to the regulation, it is not reflected in the Polish regulation.
And that works both for the financial sanctions and the sectoral, or are you referring just to 833/2014?
So, of course, it more relates to 833 due to the fact that we have only Article 2 under 269, and that one is already covered. The best efforts clause is already covered, I believe, because it was under the 15th package, as far as I remember, and that one was recognized. But let's say that EU adds Article B to Regulation 269 tomorrow, and it would not be recognized. And it's interesting when you compare this approach to the approach of other countries. So other countries address this challenge of constantly changing law in a way that they include that they simply invoke all of the sanctions introduced under Article 215 of the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union. And that's the solution that is going to be applied under the so-called big sanctions law that is being drafted right now.
And this is, in fact, I think, the approach of several member states, including French law, the reference to the treaty provision enabling the adoption of the sanctions. So there's the Small Sanctions Act, now the Big Sanctions Act. What are the key highlights of the new act, and what's the timeline?
So maybe before I will say about the Big Sanctions Act, let me elaborate a little bit more about the small one. So the small one had a few goals. So first, it was to introduce the penalties for violation of sanctions. Second, to indicate the authorities responsible for enforcement. But there were two other very important goals, which were to go beyond what the EU is able to decide. And under the Small Sanctions Act, certain national autonomous sectoral sanctions were introduced. So to give you the example, Poland prohibits the import and transit of coal before it became prohibited under the EU regulation. So that's one example. The second very important thing is that under the Small Sanctions Act, the national list of designated individuals has been introduced. And currently, after more than 3 years, we have more than 100 companies there and more than 400 individuals present on the list. And the rule is that you can only add there the person or the company that is not simultaneously sanctioned under the EU regulation. So Poland decided to sanction Aleksandra Melnichenko, and she became sanctioned by the EU. She had to be crossed out from the Polish list.
So I think this is also referred to as the autonomous national lists in the practice. What are the jurisdictional rules for that list? I think for international companies that have Polish touch points, these lists are particularly relevant. When and to whom do these specific Poland-specific sanctions lists apply?
So, of course, the scope of application is the same as the application of any other Polish law. So if you have the Polish nexus and it obliges you to follow the Polish law, you simply need to do this. From the practical perspective, of course, if there is a subsidiary of the foreign company that is registered in Poland, it has to obey Polish regulation. But there are also some nuances that might not be sufficiently visible, or maybe at least this is not in the focus of many companies. So Poland is quite famous for having a lot of shared services center. If you have a Polish employees doing here invoicing, like all of the financial, tax, or any other stuff, and if they are issuing invoices related to the company that is present on the Polish list, but that is not present on the EU list, those people who are doing this job are simply violating Polish law, so they are not allowed to do this. And that's important that the headquarters abroad must be perfectly aware of it.
That's very interesting. And in terms of the enforcement side, are the rules the same for the EU sanctions and the Polish additions, or are there nuances that are specific to the Polish add-ons, so to speak?
Yeah, the enforcement is rather the same, I would say, with one difference, or maybe no, it relates both to the EU enforcement and Polish sanctions enforcement, because the penalty can be introduced on the basis of the administrative decision. So if you violate sanctions, this is the chief of the Customs and Revenue Administration who decides to impose the penalty. So it is all under the administrative procedure. If you want to question it, at some time you might end up in court. And the thing is that due to the fact that the Polish law was quite silent for years when it comes to the implementation of sanctions, not a lot jurisprudence as well as publications like the academic publications about sanctions that could support the reasoning to be conducted by the court during the case. So the courts are also learning their job. They are adjusting and they are trying to understand what's behind sanctions, and that's not always obvious, as we all know, because that's a huge branch of law.
You mentioned that the big sanctions law is in the works. To what extent do you think the big sanctions law, if we know that, is now already aligned with the directive on the criminalization of sanctions violations? On a previous episode of the podcast, we were lucky to have a representative from the European Commission who made an extensive presentation of the directive. And the Commission this summer took action against several member states. I was wondering if you could share a perspective on the state of play in Poland.
So definitely the draft law implements the directive, and it even goes beyond it. Poland will gain the ability to suspend or to end economic relations with the selected countries. So that's the possibility that the Polish government would have. Wording of the article might look to be quite vague, because it is not specified that, for example, it means that you cannot export goods under this and that code, or that you cannot do some other stuff. So it will be a really discretionary decision of the government when it comes to the restriction they would like to introduce. So that is definitely one of the biggest difference between the directive and the Polish draft law. In addition, when it comes to the penalties, I believe that Poland here also goes beyond what what the directive says, at least when it comes to the liability of companies. That's because the maximum penalty for certain violations might amount to 200 million zlotys, which is around 47 million euros, or 5% of the revenue of the company. But there is one more important thing. So the Big Sanctions Act would not replace the Small Sanctions Act. So the Small Sanctions Act will remain in force, at least for now, covering Russia and Belarus sanctions, while the Big Sanctions Act will be covering all of the other EU sanctions regimes. I don't know it, but my presumption is that the Big Sanctions Act at some point will be covering Russia and Belarus sanctions, however they would look like in the future. However, for now, we will have those two legal acts binding simultaneously and effectively having two sanctions lists, because the Big Sanctions Act will introduce another national sanctions list as well.
So it looks like the Polish legal framework for sanctions is on the way of becoming very robust. There have been several reports in the press of enforcement activities in Poland, I think sometimes reportedly by Polish customs, but also potentially by other Polish authorities. Would you be able to share a little bit of a perspective on what you've been seeing in terms of enforcement so far, and maybe connected to the very helpful description and presentation you were making about under which regime these actions are taken, because it seems that all of this is quite novel. So it'll be interesting to see how this pans out once these enforcement actions are carried out fully.
So all of the enforcement examples are based on the Polish and on the sanctions imposed on Russia and Belarus, due to the fact that, as I have said, there is no legal ground to cover any other sanctions regime. But when we split it and would try to look at this from the perspective of the sectoral sanctions and financial sanctions, it's definitely the sectoral sanctions that are in the interest of the Polish administration. I think that seems to be natural. It's way easier to make some checks on the border, to check the HS codes and to review the papers and to introduce the penalty for violation of the sectoral sanctions than when it comes to the violation of financial sanctions. However, there are also examples of cases like that. One of the most famous one related to the company that was ultimately fined with the penalty of 4 million euros. The case there was that the company has been sold for €1 to another entity, and it was questioned by the administration that it was a fake sale and a probe to move frozen assets. So yeah, it is happening both ways, both financial and sectoral, but sectoral are definitely more in the interest, at least in my opinion and from my perception. Looking at the Polish political scene, I have to say that my impression also is that sanctions seems to be very high in the agenda of the current Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that definitely there is a lot of push on enforcement. And under the Big Sanctions Act, it is exactly the MFA who will become the leading authority when it comes to sanctions, with a huge competencies of the chief of the Customs and Revenue Administration. However, everything is supposed to be under the MFA umbrella.
Speaking of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Poland held the presidency of the Council of the European Union for the first half of the year. And during this time, I think three packages were adopted. Well, actually, I think package 18 was adopted under the Danish presidency, but technically prepared under the Polish presidency still. What were, Marcin, the key priorities for Poland during this period at the helm of the Council?
When it comes to the presidency, how they work, it is that the country that holds the presidency now is always compared with the country who just finished it. And before Poland, it was Hungary who had their presidency. So let's say that it was not that hard to be better than them. Sorry for being honest. But when it comes to the focus of the Polish presidency, everything is included in the motto of the Polish presidency, which was Security Europe. That was a simple call to the other member states about what the Polish presidency and the EU as a whole should focus on. But when we look into details of what Polish government wanted to do, there were two major things when it comes to sanctions. So first, it was to increase pressure on Russia and on Belarus, but simultaneously, and honestly, I think that it was maybe even more important, it was to maintain the unity among the EU member states, especially in the light of activities by Hungary and later. Have to say that when we look at the details of what Poland was able to do, I as a Pole, I am personally happy. Because as you have said, there were a few packages. There were two packages that were adopted during the Polish presidency. But not only, we must remember that also the renewals of the council decisions were conducted during that time. And it started just in January with the renewal of 833 regulation. Later, we had the renewal in March. It was the 269 regulation. And later the packages. When it comes to what Poland was able to do, so there was a big focus on the shadow fleet. That's for sure. It was also the time when the restrictions on the shadow fleet were, if not introduced, they were deeply enhanced, I would say. Also, it was the time when, for the first time, the Chinese and Turkish companies became designated. Also, the sanctions were extended to Belarus. That was a huge gap. That's for sure. And, I have asked one of my friends working close to the presidency, but he's not a Pole, he works for other member states. And I asked him for the honest opinion about how does he assess the Polish presidency. And he said that from his perspective, it was 8 out of 10, which I was super happy to read this and to hear this. What he said was a bit problematic, let's say, was that during the Polish presidency, Poland lacked a little bit of confidence to finish the thing and to really push at sometimes on certain matters. That only shows, in my opinion, that we as Poles, we are rather calm, I would say, and we have not used fully the potential which we had. But also an important thing is that each Pole loves to complain. So that's definitely our national trait. So let's focus on the good stuff.
And focusing on sanctions, Marcin, do you feel that as Poland has stepped up and enhanced its legal framework, so did the trade compliance community in Poland also evolve? Have you seen over the years or over the months an evolution from I would say more of a compliance community perspective in Poland?
So for sure, topic of sanctions is very interesting for many people. Many people are starting to specialize it or are showing off that they already had some experience in it. You can track it easily by seeing the number of word sanctions in your LinkedIn profile that was added after the February 2022. So yeah, definitely the community is developing, and the community is ready to voice out its concerns, its ideas, and to cooperate with the public sector. As I have said at the beginning, it doesn't matter if you are a compliance officer, Polish compliance officer, or if you are a Polish worker of the grocery store, you have the same approach towards the war, which means that definitely you cannot see the approach that would be directed at easing of sanctions. I mean, we as the community, we are all aware that that's something what will happen at some point, but definitely that's not what many compliance officers are lobbying for. Of course, keeping in mind that depending on the industry in which you operate, you also need to preserve the interests of your company. So if the sanctions are hitting you, then you will act against it. But the general goal is definitely the same for everyone.
In the course of this conversation, Marcin, we touched on the policy, the private sector, the sentiment in Polish society on sanctions and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. There's one thing we didn't discuss yet, but that you mentioned at the beginning of the discussion that is important to me, and I know it's important to you too, is research and academia. What are, Marcin, presently your key areas of research and interest? I know you recently co-authored a book on compliance that came out in Polish, but more generally, could you share a perspective on how things look like in Poland today in terms of researching EU sanctions and teaching EU sanctions? Have you seen developments, and where do you think all of this is headed?
Here, definitely a lot of things is still to be done. The market needs the people with the sanctions background. So the university that would understand it first would win this game. There are some researches that I am aware of that are focusing on the legal aspects of trade in dual use items that are co-sponsored by the state through one of the research programs. And yeah, slowly there are more and more publications, but definitely there could be more and there should be more. You can also see that what normally you might consider should be the role of the academia is taken over by the private sector. So there are more and more law firms that are providing their assessments of the Polish law in terms of sanctions. And yeah, so it is not in the form of the official academic. I can also say about the research which I was conducting in the past together with the co-authors that focused on the regional cooperation in terms of sanctions between Poland and Baltic states as well as the Scandinavian states. And that one is important to mention because that's also, it might occur to be a benchmark for the future, at least in my opinion, especially in case if the EU as a whole will either not be able to prolong the sanctions or will decide to lift some of them. So what Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland already did is that they have signed the international agreement under which a new rule was introduced into the domestic laws of those countries. And this rule says that the customs officers at the border are allowed to ask the exporter to present the manufacturer statement when the manufacturer confirms that he knows who is the end user, how his goods will be used, and that everything was done in line with sanctions. And now, again, let me put my private sector hat in right now. And definitely that's a huge challenge for the business, especially when you are only the exporter or any other kind of intermediary. And you simply are not very powerful or not powerful enough to, for example, convince one of the big German household appliances manufacturer to give you the paper where he would tell you that he knows that your end user in Kazakhstan is exactly the one that is going to use it, because the manufacturer would not want to take the responsibility for this.
Well, this is very, very interesting, and it shows that I think if you're practicing EU sanctions compliance today, of course you need to have the EU perspective, but you need to pay attention to the specificities of the particular member state or set of member states in which you're operating. So it'll be very interesting to see how things evolve in the coming months and years. Maybe to conclude, Marcin, is there anything that for you would constitute key challenges or concerns when it comes to Poland's path forward for sanctions implementation and enforcement, or more generally speaking, from an EU sanctions perspective?
So I'd like to add one more thing, maybe, like when it comes to the recognizing the global perspective or the EU-wide perspective and the regional perspective. Definitely, Spain has different perspective, having zero border with Russia and Belarus, and Poland has different one, having 600 kilometers of border together with Belarus and Russia. It can definitely change the perspective. So I would suspect that Polish attitude and the Baltics attitude and the Nordics attitude would not change significantly in the near future, at least when it comes to the governments. And yeah, let's see where we will be. A lot of work has been done at the side of the Polish government that were ruling that time in terms of sanctions. Even more could be done in the future, or also in the past during the same period. But the general approach to sanctions in Poland is that sanctions are with us and they are going to stay either in the form of the EU sanctions or as a tool of creating the national policy protecting the national interest.
Well, Marcin, thanks again for taking the time to speak with me. This has been a fascinating discussion. I wish you all the best with your research and your practice, and look forward to seeing more of your updates and comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed the show, please follow the podcast and share it with your colleagues or peers interested in EU sanctions law and policy. Don't forget to subscribe to the LinkedIn newsletter if you haven't already for additional materials. Thank you again for listening, and tune in soon for the next episode.